In the heart of the Yukon, the temperature doesn't just drop, it shatters. At 60 below zero, steel becomes brittle as glass and the air turns into a lung-burning mist. When a bush plane carrying a life-saving antivenom for a remote village crashed into the Devil's Throat Canyon, the pilot was pinned and the radio was dead. The rescue teams were grounded by a polar cyclone. This is the story of Kodiak, a 120-pound Alaskan Malamute with a coat like a winter cloud and a heart that refused to freeze. The guardian of the midnight run. Chapter 1: The Engine of the North. The Alaskan interior is a place where the map ends and the struggle for survival begins. At 60 degrees below zero, the physical world changes, spit freezes before it hits the ground, and steel becomes as brittle as glass. In this unforgiving wilderness, the titan of the tundra lived. Kodiak was a 120-pound Alaskan Malamute with a coat as white as a fresh snowdrift and paws the size of dinner plates. He wasn't just a pet. He was the navigator for Silas, a veteran bush pilot who flew that impossible routes across the Yukon. Kodiak lived for the cockpit. While other dogs were content to pull sleds, Kodiak preferred the hum of the Cessna's engine and the view from 3,000 feet. He sat in the co-pilot seat with a stoic, wolf-like dignity, his golden eyes scanning the horizon for the subtle shifts in cloud patterns that signaled a coming storm. To the isolated outposts of the north, the sight of Kodiak's massive white head in the window of Silas's plane was the ultimate symbol of hope. In the remote village of Tokotna, a medical crisis had struck. A rare outbreak of botulism was spreading through the community, and the only supply of antivenom was grounded 300 miles away in Anchorage. Silas knew the risks, but he also knew the faces of the people waiting. He loaded 10 insulated vials of the serum into a specialized medical bag, securing it in the cabin. He looked at Kodiak, who let out a sharp, decisive bark. They were the only ones crazy enough to fly into a black sky. The takeoff was a battle against gravity and ice. The plane's skis whistled over the frozen runway before lifting into a sky that looked like bruised ink. For the first hour, the flight was smooth, the aurora borealis dancing in ribbons of green and violet above them. But the North is a jealous master, and it does not let travelers pass without a price. A sudden polar cyclone, a whiteout wall, slammed into the small aircraft with the force of a tidal wave. The Cessna was tossed like a leaf in a gale. Silas fought the controls as ice began to build on the wings, adding thousands of pounds of weight in seconds. "Hang on, Kodiak!" Silas roared over the screaming wind. The engine gave a final, metallic cough and died. The plane sheared through the tops of a spruce forest and plummeted into the jagged depths of the Devil's Throat Canyon. Then, there was only the sound of the wind. Chapter 2: The Crash at Devil's Throat. Silence returned to the canyon, heavy and suffocating. Silas woke to the smell of leaking fuel and the biting sting of the Arctic air pouring through the shattered windshield. His legs were pinned beneath the crumpled instrument panel, and a warm trickle of blood was already beginning to freeze on his forehead. He tried to move, but the pain was a white-hot spike through his hips. He was trapped in a metal tomb, and the temperature outside was dropping towards 70 below. He looked to his right. Kodiak was already standing in the snow outside the wreckage, having been thrown through the cargo door. The dog was limping, his silver-white fur matted with red from a deep gash on his shoulder, but his spirit was unbroken. He paced the perimeter of the wreck, his breath coming in thick, rhythmic plumes of steam. He let out a low, mournful whine as he looked at Silas, his paws digging into the frozen crust of the snow. "Kodiak, see, come here," Silas gasped, his voice a rasping ghost of itself. The dog squeezed his massive frame back into the twisted cabin, licking Silas's hand with a frantic, desperate warmth. Silas knew he wouldn't survive the night. The internal bleeding and the cold would claim him before the rescue teams could even take off. He reached for the medical bag, his fingers blue and unresponsive. He slid the strap over Kodiak's head, cinching it tight. "Tokotna," Silas whispered, pointing toward the mouth of the canyon. "Take it to the village, boy. Save them." Kodiak hesitated, his instinct to stay and protect his master warring with the command he had been trained to obey. He pawed at Silas's jacket, trying to pull him from the wreckage, but the metal wouldn't budge. Silas shoved the dog toward the door with his last bit of strength. Go! Kodiak stood at the edge of the wreck for a final moment. He let out a long, haunting howl that echoed off the canyon walls, a promise to return. Then, he turned his back on the only human he had ever loved and vanished into the heart of the blizzard. He was alone in a world of white, carrying the only thing that could save 20 families from a silent death. The race against extinction had begun. Chapter 3: The Ghost of the Tundra. The trek to Tokotna was 40 miles of vertical cliffs and frozen rivers. In a polar cyclone, the wind moves at 80 miles per hour, creating drifts that can swallow a house. Kodiak didn't have a trail, he had to navigate by the center of the north wind and the internal compass of his ancestors. He moved through the chest-deep snow like a white ghost, his massive paws acting as natural snowshoes. Every step was a battle against the ice sleep, the lethal lethargy that comes with extreme cold. 5 miles in, he reached the glass flats, a massive frozen lake where the wind had polished the ice into a slippery, lethal mirror. Without the grip of the snow, the wind caught Kodiak's heavy frame and began to slide him toward a jagged pressure ridge. He dug his dew claws into the ice, his muscles bunching as he fought to stay upright. If he fell and the bag hit the ice, the glass vials would shatter. He crawled across the lake on his belly, a warrior in a whiteout. As the night deepened, the shadows of the tundra began to move. A pack of wolves, hungry and desperate, had picked up the scent of blood from Kodiak's shoulder. They circled him in the gloom, their eyes like yellow embers in the dark. Kodiak didn't drop the bag. He stood his ground, his hackles rising as he let out a low, vibrating growl that shook his entire frame. The lead wolf, sensing the sheer power and desperation in the Malamute, chose a different prey. The ghost pushed on. His paws were bleeding now, leaving a trail of red dots on the pristine white snow. The cold was trying to seize his joints, and his vision was starting to tunnel. He found a deadfall, a tangle of fallen timber that blocked the valley. A human would have spent hours finding a path through, but Kodiak used his massive strength to leap over the trunks, his thick fur protecting him from the jagged branches. He was no longer a dog, he was a force of nature. He crossed the final ridge as the sun began to rise, not as a warm orb, but as a pale, cold light that revealed the smoke of Tokotna's chimneys 3 miles away. He was a terrifying sight, a 120-pound beast encrusted in 2 inches of ice, his mouth frozen shut around the handle of the medical bag. He collapsed against the door of the village clinic, his tail giving one final, weak thump against the wood. He had completed the midnight run. Chapter 4: The Breath of Life. Inside the clinic, Dr. Aries was preparing for the worst. 3 children had already slipped into respiratory failure, and she was out of options. When she heard the heavy thud against the door, she expected to find a panicked parent. Instead, she found the ghost of the tundra. She gasped as she saw Kodiak, his white fur stained with oil and blood, holding the insulated bag with the grip of a titan. She had to use warm water just to thaw his jaws enough to release the handle. "Silas?" she asked, looking into the dog's weary eyes. Kodiak let out a sharp, urgent bark and turned his head back toward the mountains. The doctor understood instantly. While the nurses rushed to administer the serum to the dying villagers, Aries grabbed the radio. The storm was finally breaking, and the sky was clearing just enough for a heavy-lift rescue helicopter to take off from the regional hub. But they needed coordinates, and the canyon was a maze of shadows. The serum worked with miraculous speed. Within an hour, the first patients were breathing on their own, the death sleep of the botulism receding. But Kodiak refused to rest. He wouldn't eat, and he wouldn't go to the warm fireplace. He stood at the village gate, barking at the horizon. He knew that his master was still in the devil's throat, and he knew that the invisible fire of the cold was finishing what the crash had started. The villagers realized that Kodiak was their only chance to find the wreck. They loaded a rescue sled with heaters, cutting tools, and a trauma medic. Kodiak took the lead position. He didn't need a musher to give him commands, he leaned into the harness, his powerful legs driving him back into the wilderness he had just escaped. He was exhausted, his paws bandaged and his shoulder stitched, but he was the only one who knew the secret path through the canyon. The rescue team followed the white dog back into the heart of the storm. Kodiak moved with a frantic, focused energy, his nose to the ground as he tracked his own scent trail. He led them through the deadfall and across the glass flats, his ears swiveling to catch any sound from the mountains. He was the bridge between the survivors and the man who had risked everything to save them. The rescue at the wreck. They found the Cessna just as the sun hit the high peaks. The plane was almost entirely buried under a fresh drift, only the tail section visible like a tombstone in the snow. Kodiak broke from the harness and began to dig with a ferocity that threw snow 10 feet into the air. He reached the cockpit window and began to howl, a high, piercing sound that cut through the mountain air. From deep inside the metal, there was a faint, metallic tapping. The rescuers used hydraulic shears to peel back the roof of the cabin. They found Silas huddled in the corner, wrapped in a tattered survival blanket. He was severely hypothermic, his skin a ghostly shade of blue, but he was alive. He had stayed awake by talking to the memory of his dog, imagining Kodiak's white face in the snow. When the rescuers lifted him out, Silas's first words were a rasping question, Did he make it? Kodiak lunged forward, his massive head resting on Silas's chest. The dog's warm tongue licked the frost from Silas's cheeks, his tail wagging with enough force to knock over a medic. Silas reached out a trembling hand and buried it in the dog's thick white fur. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy, Kodiak." The bond between them had held firm against 70 below zero and the crushing weight of the Alaskan wilderness. As they loaded Silas into the rescue helicopter, a secondary fuel line in the Cessna finally ignited from a short circuit. The plane exploded into a brilliant fireball, a funeral pyre for the machine that had failed. Kodiak stood on the snow, the orange light reflecting in his golden eyes, watching the wreck burn. He had conquered the Devil's Throat twice in one night, and he had won. The flight back to the hospital was silent. Kodiak lay at Silas's feet, his heavy head resting on the man's shins. The medics checked the dog's vitals, amazed that his heart rate was steady and strong. He had pushed himself past the point of biological failure, fueled by a loyalty that defied the laws of medicine. He was the guardian of the midnight run, and his watch was finally coming to an end. Chapter 6: The Spirit of the North. Today, a small wooden monument stands at the edge of Takotna. It isn't a statue of a plane or a pilot, it's a carving of a great white dog with a medical bag in his mouth. Silas still flies the Yukon routes, but he has a new plane with reinforced wings and a top-of-the-line heater. And in the co-pilot seat, there is always a 120-pound Malamute watching the clouds. Kodiak carries a few scars on his paws and a notch in his ear, but he remains the king of the Alaskan sky. The villagers of Takotna never forget the night the ghost came out of the storm. Every year on the anniversary of the midnight run, they hold a feast in Kodiak's honor, serving him the finest king's salmon and caribou steaks. Kodiak accepts the tribute with a stoic wag of his tail, but he doesn't care for the fame. He only cares that the man beside him is safe and that the engine is humming a steady, healthy rhythm. In the long winter nights, when the wind howls around the chimneys and the mercury disappears into the bottom of the thermometer, the elders tell the story to the children. They say that the North is a harsh master, but it met its match in a dog with eyes like gold. They say that as long as Kodiak is on watch, the midnight run will never be a journey into the dark. Kodiak is more than a dog, he is a reminder that when technology fails and the world turns to ice, the only thing that truly matters is the heart. He proved that the bond between a man and his dog is a cable that even a polar cyclone cannot snap. As the sun sets over the Yukon, casting a golden path across the endless white, Kodiak closes his eyes and listens to the wind. He is home, he is safe, and he is the spirit of the North. The plane banks over the Devil's Throat, and Silas reaches over to scratch Kodiak behind the ears. The Malamute lets out a contented huff, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There are more outposts to reach, more supplies to deliver, and 1,000 more miles of wilderness to guard. And as long as they are together, the engine of the North will never stop beating. Kodiak was a dog born for the ice, but he was fueled by a love that no blizzard could extinguish. He proved that when the world is at its coldest, the bravest hearts are often the ones covered in fur. If Kodiak's heroic journey through the Devil's Throat moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Paws That Saved Lives. We bring you the most thrilling stories of animal legends every single week. Comment Kodiak below if you believe a dog is the greatest partner a human can ever have.